Hello and welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian. I am Ben DeBono here to bring you the final entry in this mini-series I've been doing called Why Would You Watch That?, in which I am looking at 3 different films, all of which are considered famous or perhaps infamous for their objectionable content. And I'm asking the question, how does the objectionable content in these films not only not hurt them as films, but actually help them with the messages and the points that they're trying to get across? In other words, how does the so-called objectionable content in these movies actually play a positive role as opposed to the negative one that might be assumed at first glance? You want to know more about that and kind of the assumptions I've brought into the series, go ahead and check out the first introductory video from about a month or so ago. So today we're wrapping up this series with the famous movie The Exorcist. And as I was thinking about this, it occurred to me that I might need to offer a little bit of explanation for why I'm including this film in this series. To me, there's no doubt this is a controversial film. It always has been in terms of how I've considered it long before I even saw it. For myself, I regarded it as a film that had a certain taboo quality to it. But as I was thinking about it, and especially as I was watching it yesterday, it occurred to me that for a lot of people that might not be the case. Simply because, even though it has a reputation, if you go back, you hear stories in the 70s of people fainting in the theaters or whatever, but you watch it today, and by modern horror standards, it's relatively tame. There are a few shocking scenes, but there's nothing in this movie that I think is overtly disgusting or horrifying, at least by the standards of an R-rated horror film. You compare that to something like A Clockwork Orange, which we talked about a couple videos ago, where that was made, I think, a few years before The Exorcist, or right around that time. And I think that movie still is shocking today. I think it's still, the objectionable content still feels taboo today. With the things going on in that movie. And I don't think that's quite the same case with The Exorcist. I think that, at least, there's certainly far more gross or disgusting or shocking in terms of objectionable quality horror films out there. So to me, where this feels like a taboo movie, though, has to do with the belief system I was raised in and a belief system that I still hold today. And I should go ahead and put my cards on the table with this because it's very relevant for this discussion. That belief system is that things like demons are real. I was raised an evangelical Christian. I'm a Catholic today. And one of the many lines of continuity throughout that transition, although there are certainly areas of disagreement between those two camps, but one of the many areas of continuity is the reality of spiritual warfare and the theology of the demonic, angels, and everything. Now, I'm not going to debate or discuss that theology at the moment. That's not really what this video is about. Suffice to say, there are plenty of people, even some Christians, who don't agree with that, and that there's another day to have that whole discussion. But for me, as somebody who does take that stuff seriously, who does believe in that spiritual world, The Exorcist occupies a very interesting space. As I was growing up and I heard about this film, it was often labeled in evangelical circles as demonic, as satanic, as evil, as something that ought not to be watched, or at least as something that is not necessarily the best thing to be spending your time on. Perhaps the most famous example of this actually came shortly after the film's release, when Billy Graham, the famous evangelist, said that there's a demon inhabiting the very cinematic reels of this movie. In other words, the physical film itself, he made the argument, is possessed. Obviously, I think that if you share my and Billy Graham's assumption that, or belief that the demonic is something real, at least a category that needs to be thought in, then probably watching a film that is literally possessed, and I suppose by extension the Blu-ray that I have over on my shelf would also be possessed by the devil, would not be something you want to do. And That's just the most extreme reaction, perhaps. I don't know how many evangelicals would go quite that far, but certainly there are a great many Christians, both during the release and since, who have regarded not only this film, but films like it, that deal with the demonic, that deal with the issue of demonic possession, as something that perhaps should be stayed away from. And so, whereas the other two films we talked about in this series more, I think, had an overlap between objections Christians would have and secular objections, we covered those, talking about those films. This one, I think, is a bit more interior to the Christian world in terms of where the objections are going to be coming from. And I'll be honest with you, after watching this film again, and it's the second or third time I've seen it, it occurs to me that I think that's very, very understandable and very, very wrong. That judgment that this is a almost sinful film to watch. Let me start with the understandable part, because I think that a discussion like this could very easily become a pile-on, and I don't want to do that. You know, oh, that silly Billy Graham, what a dumb thing to say. And I'm going to say, first of all, that I think the concern being expressed is legitimate. The concern being expressed, in my mind, at least at the base level, is that the demonic, for those of us who believe in that sort of thing, is something that should be taken seriously, that should not be messed around with, that should not just be put out for idle entertainment, at least not, you know, I don't know how many people would object to kind of the comical devil that shows up in, you know, various cartoons or whatever over the years, but you know, at least in the way that a film like this shows, that should not be treated as just idle entertainment. And I want to say, yes, I at least agree with a lot of those basic assumptions, that if you believe the demonic is real, then that's something that should be given gravity in terms of how we think about interacting with material that depicts that. Okay, so I don't think that Billy Graham or evangelicals or any other Christians who feel uncomfortable by a film like this are necessarily completely out in left field. However, I also think they're completely wrong. Okay? I think that they are coming from an understandable place, but reaching conclusions that I find to be completely misguided. And watching the film this time, it occurred to me this is one of the great moral films ever made. Indeed, I'll go farther, this is one of the great Christian films ever made. It reminded me of another controversial Christian film, The Passion of the Christ, even though the subject matter couldn't be more different in many ways. But yet these are both films that I think force belief upon you. And don't just take my word for it when it comes to The Exorcist. Director William Friedkin, when I was popped in this Blu-ray today, he had an interesting 2-3 minute introduction that was on there. I think he recorded it circa late 90s or something, because he talked about the film being about 25 years old, so that would put it late 90s, right around 2000, I don't know. But he's somebody who self-identifies as an agnostic. And he said, more or less in his own words, what I just said, that this is a film that you have to take on belief to a certain extent as you're watching it. He said in other interviews he made this film as a believer, and that's part of its success. This is a film that forces you to take that world seriously. Just as I think The Passion of the Christ takes the narrative of Jesus' death and torture and resurrection out of a sanitized, sterile Sunday school environment and puts it in a way that forces you to deal with it. And for those of us who believe that that was a salvific sacrifice, forces you to deal with the theology, both personal and on a broader scale, of what's going on there. This film does this in the same way. It forces you to deal with the reality of a spiritual world, of a world where evil exists at times in a very tangible way, but yet where there is also good. William Friedkin said something else very interesting during that introduction. He said, this is a film where you get out of it what you take into it. He says that if this is a film you go into believing that the world is a malevolent and dark place, this movie is going to reinforce that. However, if you go into this movie with the belief that there is also good, that there is also God, that the church is a powerful force for good, and I'm adding, some of my own commentary on here. He didn't go quite that far. But that there is good in the world countering that evil. Then this film is going to reinforce that, and it becomes a very positive experience. William Peter Blatty, the author of the original novel and the screenwriter of the movie, said very much the same thing. He doesn't understand why people find this movie so terrifying. It's a positive movie. It's a movie about belief in God. And part of what's so profound in this film, coming at it from a religious perspective, is the way that good does triumph in it. And that even before the wonderful part, that I'll talk about in a second, where Father Merrin shows up at the end, there's this constant back and forth where you just have a sense throughout this whole thing that evil is doing its thing. It's reigning here in this house and this girl, but yet it's not going to have the upper hand. And there's this back and forth of where the crucifix gets found under a pillow. Nobody seems to know who put it there. It just kind of miraculously appears. And then evil counters with that horrible blasphemous scene, the infamous one where she's masturbating with the crucifix, which is awful and disgusting, but yet it just shows this back and forth battle that's going on in this film. And no matter how, even though Reagan gets worse and worse and worse throughout the film, good keeps fighting back and good keeps reemerging throughout it. And that culminates then when Father Merrin shows up at the end. And I gotta say, I wouldn't look to this film for a full-on theology of how exorcism works or demons or spiritual warfare or anything like that. But I gotta say, there is some very solid theological stuff going on during those exorcism scenes. I love that Father Merrin shows up and he doesn't want to hear the background of the story. Why? Because the devil's a liar and he doesn't want to hear any of those lies. He knows the devil's going to go in lying on this. He knows they're going into a battle. And I love how he approaches this battle, that it's completely not about him. It's not about his ego. It is the very thing he says in the movie, the famous line, "It is the power of Christ that compels you, not me." So there's a great line in the movie, and again, I'm paraphrasing slightly, where in that scene where Father Merrin says, "Don't think to resist me just because I'm a sinner. It's not me who's doing this. It is the power of Christ that compels you." And I gotta tell you, just like thinking about that, I get chills, because coming at this from a Christian perspective, that does far more to reinforce my Christian beliefs and to portray Christianity as something good and right than any number of these ridiculous God's Not Dead or Fireproof movies that seem to get churned out as quote-unquote Christian films on an annual basis. They present this sanitized, watered-down, easy answers view of Christianity. Whereas films like The Passion of the Christ or The Exorcist come out and present a very different view. They present a view that forces us to be bothered, that forces us to confront blasphemy, as I mentioned in that very infamous and disturbing scene with the crucifix, and forces us to deal with the darkness in the world, but yet affirm that God is stronger. And they do that so powerfully, where those other films fail, not by being clean and by being safe, but by being difficult, by being challenging, by going into the darkness and embracing it head on. I think The Exorcist, well, again, I would say I understand where the objections come from. I think that Christians have sadly misjudged this film. This is not a film that should be imposed, but a film that should be embraced. How many Hollywood movies can you think of that actually portray the church and Christians in this positive of a light? It is a masterpiece of Christian cinema. It is a masterpiece of moral cinema, and one that is a theological home run. I can't say enough good things about this, and I hope that if there are Christians watching this who have stayed away from it because of quotes like Billy Graham's, you've misjudged this movie. It's very difficult to watch and portions, especially as somebody who takes those things seriously. But that doesn't make it wrong, and that doesn't make it bad. It makes it challenging, which is exactly what art, especially good art, should be. Alright, so that draws this series to a close then. I imagine this is an interesting topic to me. I can definitely see revisiting this at some point. I've got some other YouTube stuff planned that I'll hopefully be getting up in the next few weeks. But for now, I'm Benny Bono. This is Sci-Fi Christian.